Is China's economy really in trouble, or is it all Western propaganda?
China is facing a spiraling debt crisis and a period of deflation which could very well end their 45 years of economic growth and reform.
China's economy is in crisis mode.
Many economists are concerned that China is slipping into a period of deflation.
How do you know that a ship is sinking? Well, when it starts taking water, yes, but also when the crew jumps overboard. And that's China in a nutshell for you.
Persistent deflation for a third straight month. On a year basis, consumer prices were the slowest since 2009.
Grappling with a mounting debt crisis as investors ramp up calls for fiscal stimulus to boost the economy.
How bad are things for China?
Yes, how bad are things for China, really? Is the Chinese economy really collapsing like every YouTuber and economist are saying? And if so, what are they doing to revive it? Or is it too late? Well, before we get to that, let's rewind a little bit. Picture this, China's GDP. That's the total value of goods and services they produce. Hit a whopping $18.3 trillion in 2022. To put that in perspective, it's 73% of what the US churns out, and a mind-boggling 10 times what it was back in 1990. And let's talk cash. China's per capita income, about $13,000 bucks, roughly 17% of what the average American pulls in. Talk about punching above their weight, am I right? Now here's where things get really interesting. China's been flexing its muscles on the global stage, driving a whopping 35% of the world's economic growth in the last 15 years. That's more than a third, guys. While the US, well, they've been lagging behind at 27%. But hold your horses, because not everyone's singing China's praises. You've got your naysayers, your YouTube pundits, and your armchair economists all screaming from the rooftops that China's headed for an economic nosedive. They're pointing fingers at all sorts of cracks in the system: high debt, a wonky housing market, and a shrinking workforce, just to name a few. But here's the truth. They're probably barking up the wrong tree. Sure, China's got some kinks to iron out like any growing economy. But does that mean they're teetering on the edge of collapse? Not so fast. See, China's been playing the long game, making moves that might seem risky but ultimately pay off in the end. Sure, there might be some bumps in the road ahead, like not-so-stable financial markets and shaky property values. But does that spell doom and gloom for the whole shebang? Not necessarily. Alright, let's break it down even further. China's economic engine has been running on investment fuel for quite some time now. Think of it like this. You've got money pouring into all sorts of projects, big and small, financed by a banking system that's not exactly firing on all cylinders. Now, after the whole shebang with the global financial crisis back in 2008, China doubled down on this investment strategy. They pumped even more cash into the system, and guess what? It paid off big time. Investment drove about 2/3 of their GDP growth between 2009 and 2010. And because China's got a ton of people looking for work and not enough capital to go around, more investment is actually a good thing. But here's where things get a little dicey. See, a big chunk of that investment isn't coming from your friendly neighborhood entrepreneur. It's coming from the government. And while that might sound like a solid plan, it's not always a slam dunk. State-owned enterprises, the big dogs getting the lion's share of the cash, haven't exactly been hitting it out of the park with their investments. So what's the game plan? Well, the Chinese government knows they can't keep putting all their eggs in the investment basket. They're aiming to switch things up, focusing more on good old-fashioned consumer spending and less on building stuff. They want to see the services sector. Think of things like restaurants, retail, and healthcare taking center stage, creating more jobs and spreading the wealth around. And you know what? They're making strides. Household spending is on the rise, accounting for a big chunk of growth, and the services sector is booming. Sure, it's been a bit of a bumpy ride, but progress is progress, right? Now, let's talk debt. Yeah, it's been creeping up, but it's nothing out of the ordinary compared to other big players like the US and Japan. So, while China might have a few wrinkles to iron out, they're not exactly teetering on the brink of financial ruin like these YouTubers and so-called economies would like to have you believe. Now, let's peer into the crystal ball and see what the future holds for China's economic juggernaut. Spoiler alert, it's a bit of a mixed bag. First up, let's talk about the elephant in the room, China's shrinking labor force. Picture this. By 2030, it's expected to dwindle by about 1% each year. Yikes. Now, you might think pumping more cash into investments could pick up the slack, but here's the thing. It's a risky business. Private businesses are feeling skittish, holding back on investments when they're not feeling too hot about the economic and political climate. So, what's the game plan? Well, it all comes down to productivity, getting more bang for your buck, so to speak. See, despite all the hiccups in China's economy, they've been chugging along at a decent 3% growth in total factor productivity. But that growth's been slowing down to a crawl, hitting about 1% a year over the past decade. And let me tell you, without a boost in productivity, China's economic engine could hit some serious speed bumps. So, what's the government's master plan? Enter the dual circulation growth policy. Sounds fancy, right? Basically, it's all about striking a balance between cozying up to the global trade scene and doubling down on domestic demand and homegrown innovation. But they're running into some roadblocks. China's still playing catch-up when it comes to snagging the latest tech, and tensions with the US and the West aren't making things any easier. Plus, the recent crackdown on private firms in sectors like tech and education, that's put a damper on the whole entrepreneurial spirit thing. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the potential pitfalls that could throw China's economic train off the tracks.
And much of that middle class is confronting slower growth, an economic slump made more painful by a property crisis.
As you can see, a lot of YouTubers are sounding the alarm bells, warning that China could be headed for a crash landing similar to what we've seen in other Asian powerhouses like Malaysia and Thailand. Debt's been piling up, sure, but here's the thing. It's not exactly out of control. Sure, China's got its fair share of corporate debt, about 131% of GDP to be precise. But here's the silver lining. Most of it's in China's own backyard, denominated in their own currency and owned by domestic players. So, while it's not exactly rainbows and sunshine, it's not exactly doomsday either. But hold on to your hats, because there's a storm brewing in the real estate sector. The local governments are going all in on selling land to developers, raking in the cash and keeping the economy humming along. But here's the rub. If real estate prices take a nosedive, it could send shockwaves rippling through the entire economy, hitting everything from local government coffers to household wealth. And speaking of households, they're not exactly sitting pretty either. Easier access to mortgages has sent household debt soaring, doubling in the past decade to over 60% of GDP. And guess what? A big chunk of that wealth is tied up in property. So if the housing market takes a hit, it's not just investors feeling the pinch, it's everyday people too. But here's the thing, China's got a safety net of sorts. Most of the big players, the banks, the developers, you name it, they're all under the watchful eye of the state. So if push comes to shove, the government's got deep pockets and plenty of tricks up its sleeve to keep things from spiraling out of control. Sure, there'll be bumps in the road ahead as China tries to loosen the reins on market forces. But hey, with the government calling the shots, there's more than a good chance they'll keep the ship afloat, even if it means kicking the can down the road a bit. All right, let's zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture, the external risks that could rock China's economic boat. Now you've heard the horror stories from other emerging markets, sky-high levels of external debt, especially in foreign currencies, causing all sorts of headaches when the economy takes a nosedive.
Look at the latest headline from Beijing. Chinese investors rush abroad. Why? Because they're losing confidence in the domestic market.
But here's the thing, China's not exactly playing with fire. Their external debt, a modest 16% of GDP with less than half of it in foreign currencies, With much of the banking system under state control, they've got the power to put the brakes on any major capital outflows and keep the financial ship steady. However, while there's been some tinkering in the financial sector, there's still plenty of work to be done elsewhere, like in state-owned enterprises and beefing up the institutional framework. Without these broader reforms, China's playing a risky game of whack-a-mole, trying to stomp out problems as they pop up. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room: market volatility. The truth is that the government's been doing a bit of a hokey-pokey with market intervention, trying to strike a balance between keeping things running smoothly and letting the market do its thing. But here's the thing, it's not exactly working. Their on-again, off-again approach has only added fuel to the fire, leaving investors scratching their heads and markets in a tailspin. But here's the upside: China's got potential.
Huawei, China's top chip maker, have built an advanced processor to power its latest smartphone. It's a sign that Beijing is making early progress in a nationwide push.
With a few tweaks here and there, like more transparency, better governance, and clearer communication, I wouldn't bet against them to weather the storm and come out stronger on the other side. All right, guys, let's wrap this up with a look into the crystal ball. What does the future hold for China's economic powerhouse? Now, let's give credit where it's due. The Chinese government's pulled off some pretty impressive Houdini acts, dodging economic bullets left and right. But here's the catch: each narrow escape has come at a cost. Think massive debt, shrinking foreign reserves, and roller coaster rides in the stock market and property sector. So what's on the government's to-do list? Well, it's a bit of a laundry list of challenges. They've got to figure out how to slash debt without putting the brakes on growth, how to pivot away from heavy industry without stalling the economy, and how to strike a balance between market discipline and state control. Oh, and let's not forget about bridging the gap between the haves and the have-nots, fostering innovation while reining in big business, and the list goes on. Now, their plan of action, this whole market-oriented socialism thing, is a bit of a tightrope walk. Sure, it's got the right goals in mind, but the road ahead is paved with uncertainty and volatility. And if the government can't get its act together, public support for much-needed reforms could start to wane, putting the brakes on long-term growth. Now, let's be real. The foundations of China's growth are doing just fine, although there's always room for improvement.
More than half of all new EVs sold worldwide are from China.
Debt levels? Not worse off than everyone else. Financial system doing their thing and adapting to the times. And if the government continues to play its cards right and not let Western power bully them, it will come out of this better off than 99% of their detractors. As we know, moderate growth is not just good for the economy, but for society and the environment too.
Here is unbridled ambition to lead the world in batteries, solar panels and EVs, all part of President Xi Jinping's plan to overhaul the country's debt-driven economy, creating cars at cutthroat prices. China's competitors are watching nervously.
And there you have it, guys. China's future hangs in the balance. Will they stumble and fail like the YouTubers will have you believe, or will they chart a course towards a brighter tomorrow? Only time will tell. And to watch the latest geopolitical news, be sure to watch this video here.